All right, well, let's get started, and hopefully we will all be in a great, interactive, exciting panel to resist the post-lunch, post-tryptophan, early afternoon blues. But we're going to do everything we can with this because this is going to be a great and exciting panel. I'm Jonathan Zasloff. I'm one of the faculty members here at the law school, an affiliated faculty member for the Emmett Institute. And I teach property and land use and urban planning law. But despite that, hopefully I have something interesting to say. More importantly, I think our panelists all have something incredibly interesting to say, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. As we've all seen in the newspaper, there have been, at least the way that it has been portrayed in the press, that the federal government is providing massive new investments in transportation infrastructure. But the thing about transportation infrastructure is it can be good, but it can be very bad because it can lock people into bad pathways, particularly when it comes to climate, as was the case with important litigation in San Diego, et cetera, concerning what transportation can do. And so the point of this panel is really to discuss what this new federal money will mean and how do we make sure that we can use it in a way that can reduce emissions and not screw it up in the best American tradition. And I can't think of any better panelists to have than we have, and let me introduce who they are. Our first panelist, appearing virtually, the large figure overlooking the entire room, Beth Osborne. It's not Beth Osborne is watching you in 1984 pattern, but maybe she should be because she's the executive director of Smart Growth America. And when I spoke to a friend of mine who works on transportation policy, and I said, we're putting together a panel like this, who should be there? And he said, oh, you got to have Beth Osborne. You have to.
So true.
As the director of Smart Growth America, she's the one that is leading a lot of the best advocacy efforts, not only to make sure that transportation investments can actually work for people, as opposed to concrete, but also trying to make sure that federal and state officials can do that. She's not simply somebody who's detached. She worked on Capitol Hill for a long time and worked as the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy under the Obama administration. As well as the implementation of the MAP 21 project, the transportation funding bill. And so, you know, Beth will I will probably pose a lot of questions to her and she will tell me that all of my assumptions are wrong. But that's good. That's good because that's what we want here. And maybe she'll make sure that all of you have, show that your assumptions are wrong. First there's Beth, then is my colleague Reagan Patterson, and let me tell you a story about her that she doesn't know that I'm going to tell. Here's all this. So I was looking around on the web to see who does really good work understanding the interaction between transportation and equity. Who's been putting together studies that actually show how this operates in a detailed way. And I kept looking around, and finally I came across this study that was done for the Institute of the Congressional Black Caucus, the think tank that they have there, reading this paper concerning transportation equity by a woman named Reagan Patterson, PhD. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really wonderful. We better get her out here. This would be really terrific. I wonder what she's doing now. And so then I looked at her CV and said, wait a minute, she's my colleague at UCLA? Jesus Christ, how come I don't know this? Which tells you something about the incredible amount of talent that exists on this campus and the mission of the Emmett Institute for linking up things along these lines. She's not only an expert on transportation and transportation equity and environmental justice and air pollution, but she's also an engineer. Having received her PhD at Berkeley just a few years ago, as well as working in a consulting capacity with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So unlike, say, a law professor, she actually knows what she's talking about, which is why it's so particularly good to have her here. And third, I want to introduce an old friend of mine, Hillary Norton, who I have now known for about, well, I want to say 30 years, but then that would mean that I met you when you were -1. who has worked in transportation and politics and planning in Los Angeles and knows the lay of the land better than just about anybody else, working not only for members of the city council, but also in the development sector, in the business sector. She now runs an organization called Fast Link Downtown Los Angeles, which is really kind of a transportation management organization that does, as she says, the fun stuff for how to link people up with transportation options. But even more important than that, she runs the state of California, or at least is the chair of the California Transportation Commission, which is the body that has a tremendous amount of impact about where all this money is going to go. Because as we'll find out, the bipartisan bill, as well as the IRA, works through a state structure. And it's going to be operating through states. That's the first time I've heard about talking through a state structure that leads to music. I feel like I'm sort of announcing the Masters. But everything is going to be working through state governments, and we'll be able to see how this works. So it's really terrific to have all of them here. So let me start with you, Beth, and then go down the panel so that we can begin to talk about how this really is supposed to work. Now, when we were talking about this last week, right, I was started out by saying, wow, we have all this big new money in transportation investments. But you pointed out they're relatively small compared to what states are already spending. So the question we might as well start out with is, how should states be using these new federal money compared with its state money to be reducing emissions? Because that's really what it is. It's not just a mobility issue, but reducing carbon emissions to deal with the climate issue.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me. I am a little freaked out by how gigantic I am in the background. I'm 5'2" in real life. I joke that I'm the tallest person in every room I walk into, and finally you've made that true. So the thing to know about the bipartisan infrastructure bill is twofold. One, it's historic federal funding, but federal funding is not the majority of most states' funding, and that was true before the infrastructure law was passed. And the additional bump in money is marginal. That's not to say that there's not a great deal of opportunity to align all federal spending and state spending with our climate goals. The second thing is the tradition of federal funding when it comes to transportation is it's federally funded and state run. That means any state can do almost anything they want with this money. The downside of that is any state can do almost anything it wants to do. So the states have successfully lobbied for decades to be put fully in charge of this program, which means they have to do all the work, and they can spend this money perfectly with regard to the climate, and there will be no reward or punishment, and they can spend it terribly with regard to the climate, and there will be no reward or punishment. So looking at what you are doing and whether or not what you're doing is pushing you forward on climate is important. There are examples of different activities different states are doing in this space to make sure that they are reducing emissions and going beyond just vehicle electrification to do that. But to really get to a good place, you're really going to have to pick all the best practices and put it together. And it's something I don't think is unfamiliar to California in particular. California's used to being the first out of the gate. And in this case, they're going to have to be, because no state DOT has put together a full package as of yet.
So give the audience, and then I'll go over to Reagan. What are some of these best practices that you think are actually useful? Oh, and also worst practices, because if you've got nothing good to say, come over here next time to me.
Well, I will start with the best practices. The feds are going to get a little bit of help. They're working on a rulemaking that would require every state DOT to set targets for greenhouse gas emissions in their transportation program and require them to report back on how well they're doing in meeting their targets. And it's really hard to improve on something you're not measuring. So being exact in that space, I think, will help a lot. Colorado DOT has taken it a step further. They created a state rulemaking that requires all new capacity projects to be evaluated for their greenhouse gas emissions impact. And if it's going to go up, they have to mitigate it. They have to reduce it by the same amount elsewhere or as part of the project. And that has resulted in some projects not moving forward because it was too big of an impact for them to mitigate. That's a good way to do it. It's hard to address greenhouse gas emissions from a project if you're not really looking at its impact in that space and requiring that you at least do no damage. Virginia DOT has all the way back since 2015 been evaluating their projects based on a handful of performance measures. All new projects, new capacity projects have to go through this evaluation, and they're ranked across the state and within their districts. One is emissions, but one that I find really is exciting is they are looking at whether or not people can reach jobs and essential services no matter how they travel. It's the first truly multimodal performance measure, and areas where you can reach all the non-work destinations outside of a car tend to have the lowest emissions per capita. It also tend to be much less expensive for people to get around. Their transportation costs tend to be low. And they're also looking at whether or not people can get to jobs and essential services if you are in the 20%, the lowest 20th percentile of income. So they're using it as an equity measure as well. I also will point out, I'm very excited about California trying to replace the level of service standard, which only looks at vehicles and only looks at whether or not they're moving fluidly and with a lot of space, with instead a vehicle miles traveled measure. I think that is super important because it shows that a lot of what we do to lower level of service increases the amount of driving and emissions. And I will add, in terms of what to avoid, right now, most modeling of transportation demand needs is fiction. It's just not. It's not accurate. It's not looked at. They don't review it to see if they're getting things right. And that means a lot of times state DOTs.
Oh, she was still going.
Beth, we lost you. We lost the sound on this. So we're going to well, how about this? We'll come back to you while we make sure everything else. Reagan was here talking about discretionary spending and how that can make a big difference. We'll go to Hillary, and then we'll just come back. Yep. We'll just keep going around and around and around. And I hope everybody in the audience also knows about the QR code and how they can put questions together, because we're going to want to get to those sooner rather than later. So go ahead, Reagan.
Sure. And I'm wondering actually if Beth might have been talking about this, but we'll bounce and feed off each other.
Okay.
And so with discretionary funding, so there's discretionary grant programs. And so again, a lot is allocated already, but then there's opportunities for programs that states and other entities can apply for. And one of those is, for instance, the Reconnecting Communities program, which, again, a small piece of the pie. Even Biden's original proposal had $20 billion. It got cut to $1 billion. So it's very, very small. But I feel as though those are real opportunities to do and pilot the transformative kind of programs and things that are necessary to really have emissions reductions. And so that is something for me. Something that I also think about is how we think about emissions reductions. Everyone's talking about EVs, state DOTs, EVs. We're going to invest in EVs. However, something that I do really want to bring to folks' attention, as you are lawyers, is what's going on in Haywood County, Tennessee right now, where a community of Black farmers are actually fighting Tennessee DOT eminent domain because they are going to be building a EV facility. Blue Oval is the Ford Motor Company new EV facility. However, to build that and to build the roads to go in and out of it, they are taking land from Black farmers in Haywood County, Tennessee. We already know the discrimination against Black farmers in the United States, and now Black farming land many of which goes back over 100 years, many of which folks got from their the slave owner. So this was something that became sharecropping land. This is land that formerly enslaved folks got and then passed down on generations, is now being taken up for EVs. And so as we think about opportunities with this funding, we're investing in EV infrastructure, we're investing in EVs, we're bringing domestic manufacturing, that's great. However, who is always bearing the burden of that? And so discretionary funding is one thing that I want you to take away. There are really good opportunities, such as the Reconnecting Communities programs. However, also with what state DOTs can do, yes, we're investing in EV infrastructure, but please make sure that we are not taking land from folks the most vulnerable to do so. And so again, I encourage you all to look at that Haywood County case of who is bearing the cost for us to have this clean energy transition.
I can't imagine why nowadays, in the past few days, anybody would think that Tennessee has a racial justice problem on all of this. I mean, it does seem to be almost a repeat. What you seem to be suggesting is we're almost repeating what we did in the 1950s with a green frame on it. So if we destroyed low-income communities of color to build freeways in the 50s, now we're saying, oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore because we're going to do EVs, and we're, at least in the Tennessee case, we may be destroying low-income communities of color to build to build electric vehicle plants, and that might have there might be an emissions reduction, but the equity losses might be greater than that. Just one other thing on the discretionary spending, is that through the feds or is that through a state government? If people are looking to get their hands on that money, is that Sacramento? Is that DC? Is it both? How does it work?
Yeah, so state DOTs apply for this federal funding. So for instance, US DOT released their Reconnecting Communities program, states applied, and then recently they announced the grantees of that.
Okay. So Hillary, since you're running all of this, I'm going to go to Hillary, then I'll go back to Beth.
Oh,
so Hillary, since you're running all of this, how are you going to fix it?
Right. Yeah. Well, first, Beth, I'm very sorry that our benevolent overlord didn't get to finish what you were saying because
she'll come back. She's being benevolent, but
Yes.
we'll get back to it.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about what the California Transportation Commission does. We manage the SB1 gas tax money. So that's $5 to $8 billion every year. And that money goes towards a variety of programs that were prescribed in the SB1 law that can affect and improve our transportation infrastructure. We do not tend to fund rubber tire work, but in fact, infrastructure, capital money. And I'll get back to why that is important, that both the federal and the state money is capital money. And while we are in this, approaching this transit operations fiscal cliff, the fact that that quote, all this money is capital money has an effect on what we're doing and how we provide some equity. I will say there are a couple things that CTC and Caltrans and the state have done that I'm super proud of. One is that when I was chair, I'm the chair emeritus now. When I was chair, we initiated an interagency equity roundtable, and that equity roundtable is filled with people who are going to talk about how to do it right. What are the things we have to make up for? How do we do it right? And I will say, for the first time in a state equity advisory roundtable, we are paying people for their time and opinions, and we are paying them the same amount as we get paid, which is $100 a meeting. That's it, with a maximum of 8.
So they're good news and bad news. They're getting paid, but they're getting underpaid.
Right. Just underpaid the same way we are. But I think it's important because I feel like one of the first ways that we are not providing equity is that we ask people for their opinions and their life experience, and we don't pay them. So we're doing the opposite. I will say also, Governor Newsom, who appointed me twice, was last year put in, when we were talking about moving beyond EVs, put in the general fund $1 billion with a B for active transportation, biking and walking. That is one of the largest investments in the entire country to make sure that we are traveling differently. We don't just need to clean our cars. We need to move into buses. We need to move into transit. We need to make it safer for people to walk and bike. And we're very proud of that. And by the way, all that money is on the street. And you should know that we actually received $3 billion of applications. So the hunger for that is real. In terms of what we should be doing on the federal side to help leverage our money, we need to partner with it. And there are opportunities through what's known as the Justice 40 program, which is 40% of that money is supposed to be spent in communities of need. California is doing its best.
Wait, this is 40% of the
federal
gas tax?
dollars.
Oh, the
Federal dollars.
Okay.
Justice 40 is supposed to be spent in communities of need. So the state and the federal government is talking about where do we appropriately apply opportunities for funds. That watch this space on Justice 40, and did it achieve what it needed to achieve? How did people try to talk about what Justice 40 can do, et cetera? And many of the things that we're trying to do at CTC, because a lot of what we have the money to do is improve how we use our roadways, and we can apply that towards multimodal systems. For example, doing congestion pricing and toll lanes, et cetera. And for us, we see that as being granted 3 wishes and using one of those wishes to wish for more wishes. And the reason is that when you can put express lanes on our freeways, you can fund really good transportation. You can fund really good zero emission buses. You can fund all that it takes to run that bus system. And you have additional money.
Because people pay to use the lane.
That's right. You're paying as a driver to use the lane. You also can set preferences for cleaner cars. So UCLA, ITS did a great study that said 3/4 of the cars that were zero emission bought in California were because people wanted to drive in these lanes and in carpool lanes for free. It changes behavior precipitously, and we can then make sure that people who are low income can take that bus, can have discounts for those lanes, and we can start having a virtuous cycle. In addition, it will help us to address some of this transit fiscal cliff, because we have got to look at how our funding can go towards operating zero emission transit, getting more people out of their cars, not just changing from gas powered vehicles to a clean vehicle, but moving people differently. And so those are some of the ways in which we at the state are trying to make the money stretch, to implement equity in every opportunity we can. And we talk about it, as Beth was saying, in the example of what we need to do to justify every time we're increasing capacity. We talk about managed, multimodal, and meaningful. It's got to have safety. It's got to have opportunities for additional funding, and it's got to be multimodal. And I will tell you that in the state, all of our highway money has to have what's known as a complete streets effort. And that means that every single highway project that we fund also has to show how are you going to make it safe to bike on that freeway, to take transit on that freeway, and to walk across the freeway on and off ramps. Because
you're gonna have people biking on freeways?
People bike along freeways, absolutely, and they also bike over and next to and around. We need to make sure that we are creating systems that are holistic, and I think that's going to be the way we actually change behavior and reduce GHG.
Beth, I don't know if that counts as a best practice, but you were just going on your best and your worst practices, and then you got cut off. So tell us what you were saying.
I'm not sure where I was cut off, but
I'd asked you about best and worst practices, and you were very effusive. I'm sure it was wonderful, but try it again.
Did you all hear none of it?
No,
I don't think we did.
Sorry. Okay.
Wait. Somebody was saying. There was the Colorado rule.
Yes.
Okay.
And after the Colorado rule,
measuring capacity,
etc.
Okay. Yeah. So Colorado, I mentioned that they measure the greenhouse gas emissions that will come from their projects. And if it's going to go up, they have to find reductions elsewhere. It cannot increase GHG. That is a really important project by project approach. Because even where states are measuring overall greenhouse gas emissions, they are often not looking project by project. They basically just find out at the end of the year that, oh, we didn't make it because it's not coming down to the project level. Virginia also evaluates any new capacity project by any mode by emissions. It looks at that, it ranks projects. Projects that are increasing emissions do get lower scores. They also define, much like California is looking at is in the process of moving out of a level of service approach to traffic measurement to a vehicle miles traveled approach. Virginia took a different approach, trying to do something similar. They are measuring how many jobs everybody has access to in a metropolitan area by all modes of travel. So it doesn't matter how fast your car goes. It only matters that you can arrive at a lot of places. And the reason we've used things like level of service and delay since the 50s is in the 1950s, we didn't have the ability to measure that. But today, we have what I'd love to say is brand spanking new technology. In reality, it is fantastically old technology that we still haven't brought to transportation. With GIS, which they were teaching in schools in the 90s, this is not new. And just basic information that we collect otherwise about when transit's going to serve certain stops and how much traffic there is. And there are different ways to measure bike-ped connectiveness. You can determine exactly how many jobs can be reached within a region from anybody's census block. And you can look at any change in the transportation network or the land use system to determine whether or not we're connecting people. The beauty of this is where the access is the non-auto access is the highest, we find greenhouse gas emissions are the lowest. So we have, and it's a more equitable approach. It's not just trying to come in with a surgical approach and say, we're going to take the greenhouse gas emissions out of the system, but we're going to leave all the criteria pollutants that make people sick because brakes and tires will still be polluting, the pavement will still be polluting. We'll leave all the inequities, we'll leave all the safety, we'll leave all of the other problems in place. We'll just get the greenhouse gas emissions. Access captures all of it and it's just really extraordinary. It actually determines what people want, which is, will this project get me where I need to go? And will I arrive?
Let me just break in here for a second. So how many states are actually using an access model as opposed to a level of service model? So one, this is Colorado.
Virginia.
No, this is Virginia. They've been using it since 2015. We, along with our partners at the University of Wisconsin, published all our secrets on how to do it.
So then, well, let me just, I want to push back on this. If measuring the impact of a particular transportation project by access as opposed to level of service could be kind of a win-win-win-win-win-win-win, right? Who's losing? Why isn't this happening? Is this stupidity? Is it venality? Is it evil people?
It's just, look, government is often understaffed and overworked, and we're asking them to learn something new. And generally people don't do that unless they're forced to, and there's no forcing. So it's going to take leadership. In Virginia, what happened is the state legislature said, you're going to measure how many jobs people can reach. And so they said, that makes sense. How do you do that? And then they went and figured it out.
Would that be a better way of looking at something? I'm getting curious. Would that be a better way of looking at something than, say, like vehicle miles traveled? Because I know that under the new California model, you shouldn't be assessing things under level of service. You should be looking at, all right, if you're going to build a transportation project, how is that going to affect vehicle miles traveled overall? Is that wrong? Is it the same thing?
No, it's not wrong, and it's not the same thing. I think that what California did leadership-wise was incredibly important and something more folks could learn from. It's especially important in a lot of the designing of a project. But what we're talking about is a much broader and more complete measure here that also communicates to people in a way that makes sense to them. You know, in your region, you will be able to reach 70% of the jobs by transit within 30 minutes if we do X. This is real meaningful stuff instead of jargony stuff. And it really, I think, makes it easier to look at the impacts to lower income households, low car households, no car households, things like that. So it allows you to take an equity peak and active transportation specifically, and health impacts. It's just richer.
Reagan, you talked a lot about, trying to think of new transformative models of trying to understand what we look at with transportation. What are some of those transformative things that you're talking about? Is that the same thing as access? Is it put into any of this new legislation? Would that need new regulations? What is it and how should we do it? How's that for an open-ended question?
That's a huge question. I feel like just as I did before, one positive, one negative. So on the positive side, we have California Assemblymember Garcia had introduced AB 1788, which would have said no more or prohibited any more highway expansions in environmental justice communities. That is, to me, a step towards transformation to at least halt harm. Because what we mean in terms of transportation equity is to reduce and eliminate harm. And so if we're going to, again, just switch from an ICE engine to a battery, we're still going to have people in cars, we're still going to have increased capacity, and therefore that encourages continued freeway expansions. And who is adversely impacted by that? And so Assemblymember Garcia said, well, we're not going to have any expansions in EJ communities. That is something that I hope would have gone through and I hope would be replicated in other places. And so that's an example of something to beginning to really look at the equity piece, which is necessary for transformative and really impactful work. Then an example of a negative, to keep it balanced. And so something that I would say is a more negative thing is getting back to what is required on this clean energy transition. Biden administration, build in America. That's great. That requires new plants. And one is in Detroit, Michigan, they had the very first new auto plant opened in over 30 years. If you're familiar with Detroit, you know that was the automobile hub. And so that is, for instance, which brought great migration, a lot of Black folks to Detroit, Michigan. So for the first auto manufacturing plant to open in 30 years, economically, woo, 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 that's great. However, within months of being opened, it already had violated Clean Air Act regulations multiple times, is under investigation by the EPA for racial discrimination and citing. And so therefore, how do we do this clean energy transition? Where are states permitting new facilities, new plants? It requires new plants to be built. Where will they go and who will be impacted? And so that again gets to the air emission side. And so again, just in summary, the good thing, let's not expand highways along or in EJ communities. Ideally, let's not expand them at all. But starting with EJ communities, it did not go through. So advocate, y'all are lawyers. And then on the other side, where are we citing and permitting these new plants that will be required to build EVs?
Does anybody, does the panel know, is this the kind of thing that could be handled by the administration now in terms of new regulations concerning citing, permitting, civil rights things? Is this the kind of thing that can be done on a cleanup on the administrative side that does not require going back to Congress? Because that could be, one of the things we really want to think about here is every time you pass a bill, there are going to be problems with it. And then it's got to be, clean up on aisle transportation. So the question is, are there new regulations and administrative things that can be done to fix this? And that, hopefully Matthew Kaczmarek won't enjoin as soon as somebody sues us over it.
So as you mentioned, I worked at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So when you do citing and permitting, once it gets to kind of that EPA level, is each individual facility below regulations. And so when they put in their proposal, yeah, it's going to be below regulations. A thing that folks are really advocating for is cumulative exposures. Even though that one facility on its own is going above regulatory limits, looking at cumulative exposures, if this community is already inundated with polluting facilities, should we then even allow it, even though if that individual facility is below regulations? And unfortunately, that is how the US regulations work, is that we do facility by facility. Is this facility below? It's okay. It doesn't matter if there are 10 polluting facilities in this community, which cumulatively exceeds regulatory limits. And so that is something that folks are trying to work toward, is how to address cumulative exposures. But again, with this facility, particularly, it's even this one facility was exceeding regulations.
Beth, you've worked on in the Hill and in the administration before. Are there other things that can be done now as a cleanup that that because the bipartisan bill has been passed, the IRA has been passed, there are implementing regulations going in that always have to happen. I'll go out on a limb and say I don't think it's going to happen in Congress this term. So then where should the administration now be working in terms of handling some of the issues that Reagan was talking about and that you were talking about?
Oh, yeah. They have a lot of authority administratively that they could use. The Council for Environmental Quality that's in the White House actually manages a lot of the regulations with regard to things like NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and they just accepted comments on changes they should make to their regulations, specifically with regard to how to consider climate emissions. So they're already rewriting a ton of their rule, and we specifically called out in our comments, they're 66 pages long, several problems with the way EPA manages conformity and emissions, several problems with the way transportation.
You say conformity emissions, that means for the uninitiated, that means
whether or not your level of emissions conforms with the rules of the Clean Air Act. So are you emitting too much? If not, if you are, then there are rules that require your transportation program to conform with reductions. They call it conformity. So there's a lot of opportunity for updating some of those rules. There's a lot of requirements that the feds, that particularly USDOT controls, that gets in the way of states doing the very things we want them to do, including a document called the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices that makes things like putting color in a crossing. If you ask the folks within federal highways that manage this document, if you can paint a colorful sidewalk, they will tell you, oh no, that would be dangerous because it would be distracting. Of course, distracting the driver to pay attention to the crossing is precisely what we're hoping to do. They have not caught up to about 1992. And so we're really struggling with allowing more innovation and change. I just threw a lot of things out there, but we have a list of a dozen administrative actions we'd like to see USDOT and EPA take to improve the program to allow for more creativity.
Where can people find that?
It's on our website, transportationforamerica.org.
Okay. So Hillary, you're sitting here and you're nodding and nodding and nodding when she's talking about this, and you're not a particular nodder. There's some people who always nod no matter what you say. Yeah. But you're not a particular nodder. So what was what she's saying that seems to be your experience?
What I really like that Beth is talking about is rewarding creativity and innovation. Like, we cannot take the fun out of this. I mean, and I think overregulation has been a problem because we've regulated out some really smart things to do. I think being able to talk about jobs access and making sure that we are creating jobs for local communities, proving that we're doing it right rather than trying to regulate every possible wrong is really, really important, because there are a lot of great people coming to the table talking about how to do it right and what they want to do. In terms of clean fuels, in terms of clean fuels, the ARCHES program that is just put in an application about the hydrogen system that we want to put into California, that there's $8 billion to redo hydrogen and put a hydrogen network in our country. $1.2 billion is what's requested for the California experience. How do we make sure we have the right amount of jobs? How do we make sure that we don't do the harms that you're talking about? How do we make sure that we cite things properly? That all needs to be part of proving that you're doing it right. But I also don't want to see us just try to imagine every possible wrong and require that. I think the other is there's real focus on getting the soot out of the air for trucks. There's real focus on moving to EVs. And I think we do have to realize that idling and not having enough capacity to move is one of the things that is causing a lot of emissions. And I like the cumulative emission issue, because we're looking at ports, and frankly, the ships' emissions are a lot stronger than what is happening on the trucks. All of this is to say, we're trying to, the state has two major bills that we're working with right now with the CTC. SB 671, and it's to create clean goods movement corridors throughout the entire state, and then SB 1121, Gonzalez, and that is to then create a 10-year plan as to what we're going to do to fund all of our infrastructure needs, but that means define them too. Our infrastructure needs to be walking, biking, everything, transit, etc. And then we're going to re-examine a gas tax because we're moving away from gas. So how are we going to incentivize the right new infrastructure, pay for it the right way, and move our freight to zero emission? Those are just a couple of our assignments just for this year. It is an exciting, exciting time to be in transportation and infrastructure. And I really encourage you all to spend more time joining us in some of the really good opportunities to do it right, and then holding people accountable when they start to do it wrong.
I just want to have one question on this one. Give me an example of a federal regulation that makes it harder for you to do the work right, that they should be fixing.
I think it's very difficult right now to go from a general purpose lane on a freeway and turn that into a toll lane on a freeway. Right now, you have to do this crazy kabuki dance where you say, nope, it's a carpool lane. Oh, wait, now it's a toll lane. We should be going from one right to the other. And because right now it takes about 5 years through CEQA and NEPA just to change to tolling. We could be helping to fund our transit right now if we could make it a very quick process.
Okay, I asked for an example. You gave it to me. There it is. I want to see if we can get to some questions. Heather, do we have questions that are coming in? Can I see them? Am I? Oh no, they're here. Oh, I see. So how do I see these questions so that I can bring to you? Because right now I see a bunch of emails. One of them is from Newt and Callista Gingrich, and I just don't think that they're going to want to. I don't want to call on them. Oh, they're not up here. Oh, okay. Yeah. Why don't you show me what's going on here? Yeah. Mainly because if Newt and Callista Gingrich were here, there would be many things that I would be saying to them, but I probably couldn't repeat them. So it's not this one.
It's right here.
Okay.
I wrote them out. If you want to read them.
All right. So here's the first one on this. Okay. Here's one. How will the access model described by Beth actually address equity and the disparities described by Reagan? For example, expansion of a rail line could arguably secure more jobs for more people, but if it results in displacement of housing in disadvantaged communities, how will that get measured as far as environmental approval under the Virginia model? So for example, is it really a win-win-win?
There's a couple of questions in there that are, I'm gonna group them into two categories. One is the displacement that might be caused by a project in that it actually takes the homes or businesses to build out the footprint. And the way that an access model would evaluate that is it would look at what happens regionally in terms of access, particularly if you're looking at lower income people. If they're being moved to less accessible areas, that would rate against the project. It would also create a division that would make it hard for people to get across it. That's a nice thing. It's not just looking at whether or not people along the corridor are moving faster. It's looking at whether or not people can get across the corridor and actually reach their destinations, as opposed to what we look at right now, which is how fast are the vehicles going. We actually do not concern ourselves with whether or not people arrive. We don't measure it. We don't know. We assume they do. We hope that they do, but we don't actually consider it. That's not part of it. So it's a very different way to look at things. Now, in terms of looking at the problems that occur when we build things that are in heavy demand for which the supply has been suppressed. Right now in this country, we've done multiple studies about neighborhoods and types of communities that are in extraordinarily high demand. Those are places that are walkable, and they are ones that are transit served. We make it illegal for the most part to build the sort of mixed use, mixed income, walkable communities that people want. And much like the diamond trade, we take something that could be ubiquitous and common and we restrict the supply. And then we say, oh, you know, it's just too expensive, so nobody wants it. It's so popular, nobody goes there anymore, sort of thing. So if you start building something like that, it takes a long time for supply to meet demand. But we can't continue to restrict the supply. That doesn't fix it either. So we're going to have to think about how to give people the services that they want, even if they can't afford to bid their way out of it, while, you know, we're building our way out of this centuries-long restriction against building the exact sort of neighborhood that the majority of people are trying to get.
Now, wait a minute. I want to pop in there. I know with Reagan and Hillary, but I want Reagan to opine here too. But if you're saying that there aren't enough mixed-use walkable neighborhoods that we need to fix, if you think that a federal piece of legislation could do that, aren't you then proposing the federalization of land use?
Oh, it's already federalized. Land use came from it was created as part of the Land Use Policy Acts developed by the Department of Commerce in 1923 by Herbert Hoover. It was pushed out aggressively through the states to the localities. That's why it's relatively uniform jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But here, 100 years later, we expect every jurisdiction to fix it one by one. I don't think we're ever going to take an action federally, but we should start by recognizing that our land use policies are an incrementally changed version of what was created in the 1920s to address early industrialization, overcrowded cities, and cities that don't have good water and sewage treatment. That's where we started.
Okay, so it's not federalization, but we're going to have to change everything nationally on a local level. So, you know, there's a lot of work to do. Reagan, you wanted to talk here about it was about the access model and the you know, how to dealing with the displacement.
Yeah, so my answer goes upstream before we even get to the access model is why is the project being proposed and who will it serve? And so if it requires the displacement of people in the first place, are they the ones who are even in mind when that project is being served? More than likely the answer is no. And if the answer is no, then I would then say, should that project even move forward in this process to begin with? And so I think when we think about the do no harm, it also is who are we serving, who is benefiting, and again, who's paying the price for this. And so for me, the answer before we get into is the access model going to consider this, is that project for those people? And if they're being forced to leave, the answer is no. So let's reevaluate the project. Secondly, when we think about rail, who is predominantly served by rail? Is it, again, mostly the people who are living right next to the rail? The answer again is no. And so again, what services are necessary to serve the people that you're interested in serving? And so is a rail the best model? If we're trying to increase transit, let's go back to, is rail the best option or is it another mode? Is it the bus? Is it making sure that there are these multimodal streets? So again, my answer is let's look upstream and start with who do we want to serve? Who are we trying to serve? And so that is how I would answer it. And then this does bring a point quickly around, my background is air quality. I got into transportation from air quality. And so one thing that I know is being advocated for broadly is walking and biking along highways. I ain't doing it. Because I know the air pollutant exposure. I am not going to actively say I want to ride my bike. And so being in the Bay Area, for instance, when you cross the bridge from Oakland to San Francisco, everyone's lauding them beautiful bike lanes. And I'm like, you dying while you riding? Like, no. And so I think when we think holistically about these projects and we think about multimodal, we also need to be really cognizant of if we're building certain active modes of transportation in certain places, are there trees that help kind of decrease the pollutants along that? Are there these different measures that help to make sure? Because who are the folks who are really going to be biking and walking if they have to? it's lower income folks. So I'm not going to tell you to bike and walk to work, but put you next to a highly trafficked roadway. So you're being highly exposed. And so that's another piece of this that I just wanted to put out.
I just wanted to jump in and say yes, 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 yes to everything Regan just said, particularly the fact that a lot of times the folks we're benefiting are getting a very temporary benefit, if any benefit at all. We are often trying to expand highways to deal with traffic congestion, which just results in more driving, more pollution, and more traffic congestion. And we're permanently destroying a neighborhood to do it, not just in that we're displacing people or taking their land, but we're making their own local travel much more dangerous, if possible at all. So it's a temporary, ethereal benefit for one group of generally wealthier people at the permanent disadvantage of generally Black and brown populations and lower income people. And we get into some of this in our report called Dangerous by Design, which talks about we're not even talking about highways or rail lines, we're talking about regular old arterial roadways that create this division. On the transit point, I think it's important to recognize one of the reasons trains are beneficial mostly to white collar people is the reason we are able to build transit in this country, which underlying a lot of transit policy is we don't really want to fund it, is we will alleviate the congestion for those on the road by building transit that is focused on the white collar commute. And that's how we built our rail lines. And it's how most of our bus lines are designed too. COVID, I think, forced us to look at those other trips, which make up 80% of travel. And transit in particular needs to be restructured to think about getting people to the non-work trip. And especially for lower income people, but especially for women and mothers, it's those trips that can be totally destructive to your ability to survive. I do an exercise with some of our TA folks that makes them measure a non-driving way to get somebody from home to daycare to school to work in the morning and back. And on the way is almost impossible, and on the way back is totally impossible. And it's not, the work trip alone would be fine. It's all the other trips that are so destructive, and transit, bus or rail, is not currently designed to serve that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would just add, I think there are a couple of places in terms of like the watch this space that are kind of interesting to me. CTC has just last year relinquished the 710 North Corridor. That's 55 acres now of what was a highway, a spur, because we're not building the 710. That's going to go back to being able to be redesigned to be a transit connected community. There are places, as we're talking about reconnecting communities and providing potentially reparations to mostly African-American Northwest Pasadena for having paved over that part of the community. I think we also need to look at the places where things are going right. Transit, I will say one of the challenges about transit is let's not forget how costly it is. It's $1 billion a mile to put in an average rail system, especially in Los Angeles. I do want you to know, though, that we just yesterday were meeting with people along the Crenshaw line and in West Hollywood, where the Crenshaw line is going to go. And all they can talk about is how to make sure that there is jobs access. This isn't about people taking the trains just to go through African-American neighborhoods. It's about serving African-American neighborhoods and providing additional access to jobs people want to have. So I want to make sure we're not always talking about just one thing happening all the time with every kind of mode. There are places where really unique things are happening. People are biking safely. They are doing extraordinary new things. And I think we should be celebrating it, because this is the time, going back to what the federal money can do, to do great pilots and make sure we learn from those pilots and do it everywhere else.
Why is it $1 billion? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Reagan.
And so I agree, we should highlight the wins and highlight the need for these to be successful holistically, need to be partnered with non-transportation entities. And so bringing up the Crenshaw line, a concern is housing and displacement, which is a concern across LA. I mean, heck, I'm a professor and I'm looking at these prices like, oh my God. And so it's making sure that, yes, we have the line, yes, we have jobs, can people also stay there? And so making sure that, are we talking to housing? Are we talking to affordable housing? I moved from DC, and interestingly, since COVID is now over, y'all.
Right.
COVID is now over. So in the DC budget, for instance, they want to decrease housing assistance by almost 40 million in order to find tax abatements for businesses in the downtown to revive the downtown. And so I say that to say housing, the prioritization of housing, we might start to see a shift. We're starting to see a shift already happen and as budgets get proposed. And so when we talk about transportation, we talk about the good in these innovative projects, making sure they are coupled with the good of housing assistance and making sure that people stay. So just a point of emphasis that these innovative things also have to make sure that housing and other forms of assistance are coupled with them.
This is actually going to jump off on something that I was going to mention, and I think it was one of the questions here. Why is rail $1 billion a mile? I mean, is it $1 billion a mile in all countries? What makes rail so expensive? Is this being recorded? Yeah.
Well, often,
To the extent that you can say.
yeah, I mean, often you're going through developed areas. The CEQA and NEPA process is long. It's very expensive to do things, and goods are expensive to in order to make it happen. But there are a lot of conferences that are happening right now about how we actually go out to bid on projects and what we're doing to make them so expensive, because we really do have a very expensive system. So I don't profess to know all of it, but a lot of it is just the length of time, and frankly, that unfortunately in California, we built communities and then said, how about doing the transit? We could have done it differently.
I actually participated on a panel with some folks at Eno who studied this, and one of the things they found, yeah, they're a big transportation group here in DC, a think tank, and they're really fun to work with, very smart people, and they pulled together folks to look at this issue, but also to compare our management of transit projects with other countries. And this is the deal. The countries that build the most transit bring the cost down the most. We don't build that much transit. So every time a transit agency goes out and builds something, it's a once in a decade project. It's a huge new undertaking where all the people who did the last one are gone and you're starting from scratch, and you know that this is your one chance. So you put everything into the same contract versus, you know, if you're looking at Madrid, if you're looking at Barcelona, Paris, Stockholm, these places are constantly building, and they're able, because they know that the commitment to the transit project, or all of them, are not going to go away, and the funding's not going to go away. They're breaking them down into much smaller, more manageable projects, and they are expert at managing it because they have the chance to build the experience. In the US, transit is something you can get to once we've gotten through everything we really value. And if you look at the federal side, transit gets 20% versus highways 80%. I mean, is there any stronger way to explain what our priorities are? And more importantly, the highway funding is protected in a trust fund, but the new transit funding has to be voted on every year by our appropriators. So it's just, we handle it very differently. And transit is something that, unfortunately, politically at the federal level in particular, you have to kind of pay off the interest groups to get to the stuff that people really value, which is the highway funding. And it just keeps showing up in a multitude of ways because we're not becoming real experts in this space.
I would think, I want to just keep pushing on this. I would think that there would be a lot of interests who would be very interested in increasing transit funding. You know, you got a lot of, you know, steel makers who make the railroad cars. You got a lot of people who would want to be the engineering firms that would want to be building these things. You know, this looks like a political process failure, that somehow that you've got a whole lot of interest groups that are are being helped by highways, and so they lock up the system as opposed to transit. But you would think that there would be a whole lot of money in transit. No? I'm just pushing back. I mean,
I think there's a
what
couple.
the hell is going on Capitol Hill, Beth? It's your responsibility.
I refuse to accept that. I think there's a couple of things. One is there is a belief at the federal level that transit is only for big urban areas, and big urban areas have very little representation on Capitol Hill, but particularly in the Senate. If you talk to members of the Senate, 100 members represent rural states. They will tell you that, including the Californians. So that's a pretty, talking about rail transit as something useful for rural America is a hard sell. And they're always, if you're a Republican, your base is in rural America. If you're a Democrat, you're trying not to bleed out in rural America. So that's all people ever care about in the Senate. That's problematic for this space. Though I think that's turning around because rural America is really focusing much, much more on transit, since so many of the things they need have been closed up and moved further and further away as those communities are aging. The other thing is, the last time there was a real constituency on Capitol Hill for transit was in 1982, where they really negotiated hard for transit. And that's when urban members of Congress.
1982, you said? Or 1902? What?
1982. When there was a big increase in funding for transportation, and urban members said, we won't support more funding for transportation unless a certain amount is walled off for transit. And then that's been the bipartisan agreement since, and it's never been renegotiated. In terms of interest groups, I think a lot of them just don't want to, it's a bipartisan issue. Why would you want to stir the pot? We stir the pot, but that we're not, that's kind of why we were built. And from a perspective of the firms, they're expert on highways. That's the stuff they know how to churn out. So they're comfortable continuing to work in the spaces they already know how to work.
And let's not forget that bus systems and streetcar systems do not cost that amount of money. We have lots of roads. We have lots of opportunities to move to zero emission buses, electric streetcars. There are lots of opportunities for transit that are not rail, and rail's doing okay. And we're going to develop around it and make sure we have equitable communities in that area. But again, this is the time to talk about how do we pay for what and what should be our priorities. And there's never been a time, I think, where someone who's just a person on the street has more ability to talk about what is needed and have that really matter. I love that about what's happening right now, is that the community outreach process is changing. It's not perfect, it's changing. And please make sure, if this is important to you, which I hope it is, talk all the time, because there are some things we should be changing, and politicians respond to what they hear, and what they hear is based on what lots of people are saying. So add to that conversation. It's really, really important.
How do people do that? What are the ways in which people should be adding to conversations?
I mean, join Transportation for America. Go to any, look at all of the—
Your check is in the mail.
Look at all of the CTC meetings that are public. Metro, every single meeting is public. Speak at public comment. People actually listen to public comment. And one blessing of a terrible COVID pandemic was that many of these meetings are now virtual. And so they are much more accessible, and they are being required to be translated in multiple languages and American Sign Language. You didn't have that before. I just think it's really an opportunity to avail yourself of this. And if you don't find that they're meeting your needs, write to people and they are listening, because you're all part of the infrastructure about how we're going to pay for things, how we're going to use things. Ridership is important, data is important. And so you have a lot of autonomy over what could happen in the future. And that is one thing I want you to leave with, is that there's a lot of opportunity for people who aren't experts to be really, really listened to, and to become part of the important coalition of consumers that is going to change the system for the better.
And two things to get back at the why. transit is not where it needs to be. One is, we are paying how much in California for gas? And are we seeing a huge shift? I still drive my car. Folks in here are driving their car. It's very much entrenched. Paying $5, some are charging. I had to scream at my mom. Well, we screamed together in the car when we saw like $5.99 the other day. And that's insane, but we're still driving. And there's a lot of things contributing to that, because one, are there really any viable alternatives the way our system has been set up? Two, well, really, there's no viable alternatives to the way in which it's been set up. And so we're still doing, it is entrenched. So that brings me to my second point. It is very much entrenched. And so we talk about priorities. Is it a priority for us? We're not at arms. We're not, what was it, the 1970s oil embargo, where people are up in arms talking about that. We don't have the same kind of mass mobilization that's happening around that. So we know that price gouging is happening. Congress knows price gouging is happening, but are we complaining? Is it on the news every day? No. And so we've kind of accepted this. And so again, it is entrenched. And so until we have that mass mobilization, that engagement and getting involved, I think we're going to continue to see it being entrenched. Public transit is not treated as a public good. Folks always talk about funding. And
how can transit pay its own way, and which we don't expect from highways?
Yes. And so Beth talked about the 80-20. And then also, if it was a public good, that percentage would shift. And also, where do we get the money? I am just going to put my political views out there, because it's a law room and that's okay. So I'm just going to say, how much are we investing, for instance, in mass incarceration in this country? We sure got money to build that, but we don't have money to build transit. So there are pockets of money. It's how we allocate that money. It's not, is there enough funding? It's, where are we prioritizing our funding? And so I just want to leave with that emphasis around mass mobilization around this, but also when folks ask you, we don't have no money, where are we going to get it from? Say, let's look at your budget. There's a great billboard in Koreatown where $1 billion of LA City Council is going to policing, and the rest of all of our public services are this much. It's a great bar graph. Has anyone seen it in Koreatown?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, we could debate that. So, but I will leave it at what are we prioritizing? What are we prioritizing? Where are we allocating? And what is our mass mobilization?
Okay, so I think that what we've concluded now is, from all of this, since we're just about out of time, what we've concluded now is, first, everybody should join Transportation for America.
Smart growth.
Second,
America.
and Stroughton Brothers of America. Everybody should go online to California Transportation Commission hearings and tell Hillary what you think, because she's running the state and doing everything.
Sure.
And if you have any questions about priorities, you should make sure to Google Reagan Patterson Consulting, and her engineering page, and you can link onto that. So now we've all got our marching orders, and we can go ahead and transform the country.
One more thing to a room full of
for it.
lawyers. I work a bunch with state DOTs, and I'll give you one example of something that lawyers particularly could influence. We are working on a quick build temporary project on a dangerous intersection, something that we test something out, see how it changes behavior and learn from it. And then we could build something permanent and get really good feedback from the community, not based on an engineering sketch, which means nothing to nobody, but actually based on what it looks like. And that project was taken down because there was concerns about the changes not meeting standards. And council thought that they could be sued for doing things differently. They were not concerned about being sued for people dying.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make a value judgment. That's bad. So we all have our marching orders, and now we'll go ahead and do it. So thank you, everybody, for a wonderful panel. I really